All right, good evening. I know I'm breaking convention. I'm a little bit early tonight, but I think you'll forgive me when you see what we're going to be talking about tonight. The play is the thing you see. You've probably heard that phrase before, usually incorporated with a conversation about Shakespeare. I'd say line, of course, from Hamlet. The plays the thing wherein we capture the conscience of a king. But I want to talk today about playing as a thing because there has been a radical change in the last 25 to 30 years of what it is to play. And I want to talk about that in a broader term than perhaps you might have talked about before. And if you haven't yet, go ahead and push all the buttons down below because I need to be able to show YouTube that there is an audience for this stuff. So please accommodate me if you can. It also supports you because if you subscribe, for example, on Twitch, you no longer have to watch the commercials therein. And if you subscribe on YouTube, you have my everlasting gratitude, and also you'll be advised whenever I make new updates. Make sure you open the little bell thing and let them know that you want to know when all new videos are created. All right, so shall we get started? Okay, now you'll notice something else that's changed. I have a second camera. I don't know how well this is going to work, but I'm hoping that it'll keep your attention up and allow us to be a little bit more animated in our conversation. Today we're going to be talking about playfulness, and I'm going to take you back, and I suppose for most of you this would be way back, way back, but I started playing role-play games when I was 11 years old, and I was already a gamer by that time. I just didn't know that's what we were called yet. My grandfather and my family had always been card game players and such, and so it was simply a way of communicating for us. It was a process by which we gathered information and shared it with each other while doing other things. And so we're going to be talking about play in this context. When grandparents or parents would say, go play, they were advocating for us to activate our imaginations and go find something to do. It was not a situation where they had a games closet full of games that they necessarily wanted you to play. There wasn't even a parameter for you to keep score or let anybody know how the games went. They didn't care. They wanted you simply to go play. And this air of playfulness is really what we're talking about today. The idea that we don't have to have objectives or agendas or politics or anything else driving us to participate, but simply that participation will by necessity bring out imagination, creativity, and newness of thought. And today, as we go over this, I think you'll see why I advocate in particular for role-playing, but we'll get back to that in particular when we get to that section. Okay, so I obviously jumped past my header this time. Ha! And that's okay. We are actually talking about an appeal for the return of recess. And don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we need to regress. We don't need to go backwards. It's not like we have to make games great again or anything like that. What I'm talking about is that we need to consider what it is to be involved in playing and try to get a better handle on what that really can mean. Because in our culture today, play has been appropriated, perhaps marred, perhaps modified by different people for different reasons at different times. And so when I say, hey, let's go play something, the concept has been subsumed by a lot of different things. So I want us to kind of redefine the very concepts that we've worked with in terms of playfulness. Now, there is an air of levity when we talk about playfulness that can be misconstrued, and so I'm trying to be as politic as I can be, but also to be as clear as I can be that what I'm talking about is the very essence of playfulness. Now, in my case, I'm in a pretty unique condition. I am a writer and an author and a professional game master and a storyteller, and so my schedule doesn't match with the standard usual routine. I don't have a 9 to 5, or so to speak, that I have to depend on for what I do. But the idea of playfulness in terms of recess is this: when everything you do, when every action that you take is in the pursuit of generating revenue, or in pursuit of winning, or in pursuit of one-upmanship, these all are aspects of play that were not there initially. And I know that everybody's life is different. Every experience is going to be different. So I'm only going to be speaking from my case and 50 years of experience. But when we talk about the idea of recess, we're actually talking about the idea of disconnecting from the mechanism by which we do things in order to relax, retool, reconfigure, reinvigorate, recreate, or recreate, depending on how you want to term that word. But the idea that our play has changed, I think, really stems from several different aspects, and I'm going to be talking about them all. And although I have a set agenda, I'm probably not going to follow it very well, because I've always been one of those persons that doesn't conform, so to speak. So, in particular, at this point, I want to talk about the very idea of playfulness then to now. When I was a youngster, it was the 1970s. And if you think about a lot of things that are going on in today's world, they were going on then too. There were government shenanigans concerning finances. There were government shenanigans concerning income tax. There were adapting and shifting rules about the stock market. Interest rates were going through the roof. Inflation was a monstrosity. And it was difficult to muddle through. But mostly that was a grown-up world. Children were, in essence, children. There were different adages that were being adhered to, like children should be seen and not heard, which is far, far from us nowadays. That the difficulties that kids had were insignificant and not to be considered. There was far less diagnostics in terms of what medically can be done to adjust or alter a person's mood. There were arguably, either less resources or less focus on these kind of things. And therefore, the idea of kids was that they muddled through. They would just go do things. And I do recall that it was always a challenge when dealing with trying to get your parents to engage in games and play with you, because they had their own lives and you were an ancillary, if you will, to their lives. And your desires were not as prioritized compared to today's world. And perhaps that's because of helicopter parenting, or perhaps it's because of the ideas and concepts of child rearing that were in place. Granted, I was raised for the most part in the American Midwest. We traveled a lot. We moved a lot. I went to 40 different grade schools and 6 different high schools across 11 different states. And so I got to see a lot of country, and I got to meet a lot of people, and I got to play a lot of games with a lot of different groups. But the reality is that kids were kids. When it was 3 o'clock was came around, when you left the school, you headed back to your home turf, not necessarily your home. We had basically an effective play area of about 2.5 to 3 miles around my house, and we didn't stay localized much. We had bicycles and roller and skateboards and roller skates and all kinds of modes of transportation that we could affect. And we had, I mean, in today's, the idea of the way we played back in those days wouldn't even be conscionable in today's world. My parents would probably be pulled up on charges for not being aware of where we were and things like that. I remember there were, hard and fast rules. You had to be back within sight of the house by the time the city streetlights came on. If the streetlights came on and you weren't home yet, you weren't within sight of your home, you were beating feet to get there because you had to be accountable. You had basically had to be within the range of your parents' voice. If mom or dad came to the door and said, Johnny, get in here, you were headed home. And the odd thing about playfulness back then is that we didn't really consider it to be a chore. I know that there are parents today who schedule playtime, which is, to me, it's unconscionable that children have to hold out for when their parents are going to give them playtime, and that there's on the other side, I suppose, on the other side of that coin, there was an accountability in terms of responsibilities. I mean, we had our selected, our assigned chores, things that would have to be done within the parameters of our day that had to be accounted for. You had to, if you were tasked with taking out the trash, you had to make sure all the bins were less than half full at any given point, because who knew when you were going to go through somebody's drawer and toss out a bunch of stuff. So you always had to keep all of them checked. And if you were doing dishes, of course, you had to wash them in hot water, hot enough they would almost scald your hands, and you had to use the scouring brushes and elbow grease and all kinds of different, I suppose they were colloquial terminologies at the time. But the idea that once you had accomplished whatever those were, and whenever you had finished whatever assigned homework you had, and back then that would be, it itself might be an hour worth of projects or pieces that you had to work on. But once you had all that done, there was no box. My cousins, as they were younger than I was basically the oldest of the entire flock. As the younger cousins were coming up, I would see their situations radically different from my own. They would have piano lessons, and they would have dance lessons, and they would have singing lessons, and they would have da 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 da. And I mean, I'm aware that it was far worse for in the case of my grandkids, as far as having obligations that were preset for them, so that it was hard to see how a kid could even breathe, so to speak, in today's world. But even with our laissez-faire lifestyles, I remember school there was a great value placed on especially in grade school, and perhaps even into early part of what I would consider middle school, which they now call junior high. The idea that there would be breaks in the schedule where you had no obligations other than to go play. You were assigned a time and a place, and you were assigned to go do that. And it was liberating when you, for example, got out of your spelling class and you finished your spelling projects and the bell rang and it was time to go. You were out in the great wide open of the playgrounds, and you were making connections with your friends and deciding. I can't even use terms nowadays. Like, yeah, I can't say that we used to in our back in my day we used to say we'd hook up, and that just meant we were going to get together to do something. And now hook up means a completely different thing. So I'm just saying that in those days, grade school, the bell would ring, you go outside, find your friends, and then you would go play something, whether it be an organized sport like four square or two square, or hopscotch, or and then of course there were the activities that were not specifically related to that. They were not games. They were simply physical activities that were enjoyable, like a teeter-totter or jungle gym or a merry-go-round or a swing set, most of which I know have been pretty much abolished from school grounds in these modern times because of the dangers they have come to represent for kids hurting themselves and or being hurt on the playground. And I get the desire to maintain discipline over children, but I don't get the regimentation that is placed on them, because one of the ways that humans learn to socialize is by playing. And the idea of playing within the parameters of an open playground without any parental or teacher direct intervention. There's a difference, for example, between a recess and a physical education period. If you were doing a physical education period, yeah, sure, I could see organizing and regimenting games of kickball or races across the ground, the grounds of the school, or all kinds of different things, dodgeball, etc. And those events that are in a physical realm, sure, there is a big part of that. But I think that one of the biggest challenges is that we have forgotten, and I think that's really what I know that's what I'm really focused on in my life, is to find ways to help you get your games group to play together more and get more out of it. And one of the ways we do that is we unbind our minds, and the recess was a way to do that. And so when you were therefore a player in a game, usually in an open, like, for lack of better terms, cops and robbers, or adventurers, or whatever, the idea of inputting creativity was a combined effort. It wasn't just one person who was defining it or clarifying it. It was literally everybody at the in the game would be adding their part. And again, these games are not the focus that they later became as I got older. And I know it's true in high school that they start adding intramural, and locally competitive sports. And I find it interesting, though, when I talk to somebody about being a games player, and in particular a tabletop games player, I'm partitioned off almost immediately because they don't perceive of that as being as culturally valid as being a sports aficionado. In other words, if I was a fan of this football team or that baseball team or that track and field star, then I'm going to be in a more competitive realm and therefore more socially acceptable. And so I've just watched the erosion of the very concept of play as we have it seems like we've done everything we can culturally to undermine play for play's sake and replace it with play for competition. So this appeal for a return of recess is really an appeal for us to return to what it is to be human. In other words, yes, we have a long gestation period as human beings. I think I read someplace recently that they've determined that the human brain is not truly and fully developed until the human being has gotten to about the age of 20 to 25. I think it's 20 on the higher end of that. But the idea is that because we've got such a long gestation, there is a lot of interpolation and interpretation and acquisition we have to make about our surroundings that really depend on playfulness. You see, when we are endeavoring to learn and to hold on to concepts, we have to play through them. It's really no different than any other activity. If we are going to learn to be polite to each other, we need to be in situations where we are required to be polite, where we need to be able to understand what is going on in the minds of others, and we have to learn the ethics, not just the ethos, but the ethics of kindness, of being fair, of being just. And these are not terms that are easily transferable, simply by your dad saying, you must do this thing, or your mother asking you to do this particular project. It's a matter of you have to learn to grasp the experience, and the only real way we can do that is to interact with it. And I think one of the reasons why we end up with competitive sports and cultural disconnection is that we haven't yet developed how to play with one another. And that's one of the reasons why I advocate for us to take a piece of time, morning and afternoon, every day, and just disconnect and go back to where we were when we were those kids. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily you have to run outside and get on a swing set. Not that that wouldn't be a great thing. In many cases, it'd be a very nice thing to be able to, get away from it all, get back to the way things used to be. But even if all we do is an exercise in creativity and in imagination, whether it be work a couple of jigsaw puzzles or work some crosswords or play a couple of board games with somebody, these pursuits that don't have a price tag associated with them, that we're not doing it to generate money. We're not doing it to bring home the bacon, so to speak. I get frustrated when we hear people talk about being playful in today's world, and they immediately go, yeah, play the lottery. It's like, well, no, the lottery is not play, because the only part that is even close to playfulness in there is the portion where you are imagining what you might do if you got the winnings. But that can be done without having to fork out the dough, so to speak, to buy the tickets. I know that sounds crazy, but the idea of musing about what you might do with revenue that is not tangibly or even statistically reasonably possible is a negative pursuit of creativity and imagination. Instead, a better way would be to simply disconnect and say, what does it feel like to have the breeze on your face? Some people like jogging and running and, being outside and all of those kind of things. And those are valid pursuits for respiratory health, physical health, those kind of things. But they're not playful on their own face. You have to actually endeavor to bring the playfulness to those cases. And I think that having an argument, even if it's perhaps specious, to say that we can actually take back the idea of recess and simply say, for the next hour and a half, we're not doing anything. And I know that might be a long period, compared to most people's lives. The idea of taking even a half an hour and stepping away from your occupation desk and moving out into another place and another time in your mind, so you're able to unwind and disconnect. Actually helps to regenerate or charge your batteries better. So, how do we engage playfulness? Well, the first aspect of engaging playfulness is the decision to do so. And this really means find a reason. Some people engage their playfulness by scheduling a game session. Yes, that's again a downfall of adulthood is that there are things you have to do and schedules you have to keep. But if you don't engage your playfulness and plan to be creative, be imaginative, you're going to miss out on the real benefit of that playfulness, because we are beings who intentionally do things. And if you think of your cell phone and you think about the quote games, many of the games that are on the phone are not games at all. They are perhaps at best a piece of mental gymnastics, but it's still a burning of your time, because you're doing actions to get the bells and whistles on your phone to, to express themselves, and you're trying to get those instant dopamine hits. It's similar to some of the, I mean, there are games, don't get me wrong, I'm not poo-pooing all games on a phone. There are games that are engaging, that are two-player. You can play chess, you can play Scrabble, you can play Words with Friends. There, Wordle, I guess, is the newer one, Sudoku. Those are all mental puzzles, but they're not actually engaging the creativity to the level of which I'm recommending. Engaging playfulness would be the closest we get, and it's in a negative, are those areas where we seek to deceive one another. And there are several games out there that have been released in the recent past that are specifically designed to cause you to consider being deceptive, whether it be the video game Among Us, or there's a dozen different games like Werewolf that are actually meant to teach you. They fundamentally teach you how to prevaricate, how to lie convincingly, and how to protect your resources while taking from another. And I suppose this really goes back to engaging your playfulness doesn't even necessarily include organized sports, unless you are involved like in a fantasy league or something like that, wherein you have some agency in the game in terms of which players. Now, as soon as I say that, I realize I'm actually being somewhat self-defeating, because the challenge with a fantasy football league or whatever, is that you are turning around and fundamentally finding ways to win. And we should talk about that a bit, because playfulness doesn't necessarily mean winningness. And our worldview has radically shifted to that note, that we are actually endeavoring, whenever we get involved with anything in terms of a sport or what we call a game, we are looking for winning. And the advent of the Kickstarter process for manufacturing of new games has really ratcheted this to the nth degree, to the point where there's actually a lot of people that are soured on board games unless they are collaborative, because they are tired of playing to win or getting defeated because the other players at the table are being so competitive. And I think this is another one of those places where we need to make a quick disconnect here and engage the playful side of it, and eliminate or reduce at least the competitive side of it. Now, you might have a different opinion. I'd love to hear from you, and we could have a great conversation in the comment section below. But the idea that I have to be a competing person to enjoy a game is tacitly ridiculous. I'm reminded of playing Monopoly with my cousins, and they loved Monopoly because they were always striving to win. And what I found most enjoyable to me was playing not for me to win, but to make sure that they also didn't win. So the idea of playing for alternative purposes, playing with different strategies or agendas, the very concept of playfulness is engaging one another so that we're all getting our input. Now, as I've said dozens of times before, I am a game master for role-playing games, and role-playing really defies most of the game's elements out there. Now, there are some games that laughingly poke fun at role-playing games, like Munchkin, wherein you are playing the archetypical role, and you're kicking down a door and you're beating up a monster and you're taking its loot. But that's the reason why that game's funny, is that there are so many people that actually play that way, that they think that they are, quote, winning at role play games. And I did make a video. I'll put a link to it down below. But the concept of playing a role playing game to win takes a different perspective on winning before it's really effective. And that, I think, is one of the things that we really need to adjust and shift culturally. Now, there's a lot of talk right now, and I could spend as much time as anybody else kibitzing over what is or isn't in the Dungeons & Dragons 2024 Player's Handbook DM's Guide. But I think we really have to back up and talk, as I said, about what is playful, what is enjoyable, what is fun, and find ways to gain access to those creative functions without having to either stick a flag in the ground and declare a position, or retreat from position, waving a white flag of parley. It's really a matter of deciding what the game is that you're playing and why you're playing it. And to engage playfulness is going to be across the spectrum. So again, going back to the concept of recess, if we determine that a recess is only a block of period time, and when the period of time is over, we have to go back to regular work, then it makes sense for that play to be as disconnected from the reality facets as possible for it to do its greatest work. That is to say, if you are an industrious, super effective, super efficient worker, when you get to your point in recess, you should be as crazy, hog wild, and off the chain as you can be, because that gives your brain that ability to use the resources that are underutilized to actually accomplish those things that you want to accomplish. Woo! Rang my bell. All right, let's get here. So this comes down to redefining play parameters. And so when I say those words, redefining parameters, what I'm saying is, let's adjust the goalposts again, shall we? As I said, when I was a youngster, there were no goalposts. You didn't have to do this or that to accomplish. There were video game arcades in the vicinity of my home. I did go and play them occasionally, but I didn't play the endeavoring to play a game to put your name on the top of a scoreboard is only really effective if the game itself is intentionally competitive. And video games by nature tended, at least back in those days, to be such. There were very few where you could play through a story and just collect the pieces of the story without it also being necessarily competitive. And in today's world, I think that kids, especially youngsters, are really being pushed into being ultra hyper competitive on things that should be playful. Um, my sisters, when I was a youngster, always talked about wanting to be involved in the local pageants and all of that as far as beauty and attractiveness because that was promoted. But they also only did it in play. They never actually participated in any of those things competitively because it's a tough break to take something that is natural and true of virtually every child. They're all beautiful in their own way. And to have them have to compete and then reward one over the other is I mean, there are activities that we get involved with that should have participation awards. I mean, I'm saying that I should look around for me to get struck by lightning, but the reality is that that's absolutely true. There are things that we should be rewarded just for trying because the competition is useful and healthy. But having said that, if you put that parameter onto every activity a human being will do, you soon turn all of them into some form of work because people endeavor to try to be best at or right about something in all of those categories, and those are problematic. So we have to redefine what we mean when we say go play. You know, the sticky wicket that I'm in, I suppose, is that as a professional game master and storyteller, I want to advocate for you to get involved with organized play to the extent that you have a games group that you get together with and you play. Now, does that mean you play the same game every week? No. Does it mean that you have to play that style of play? No. But the idea is that you create camaraderie and connection and you allow your brains to disengage in ways that don't otherwise. I'll do a video in the near future about the actual merits of role play and why that form of play is useful. But I think I'll also then build out a series talking about all the different styles of play because there are merits and benefits to any form of engagement where you disconnect your work mind and engage your creative and playful side. So just look forward to that in the future. As my grandfather would say, I said all of that to say this. We need to decomplexify and redirect our focus in our world. If your employer would not even consider the idea of a recess, I know that there are those of you that have tobacco fixation, and so you get your smoke breaks. I know that the work ethic here in California does require, I believe it's a 10-minute break every 4 hours and a half-hour break for a meal. And there's all kinds of frameworks that we build to fence in that liberty time. But we need to learn how to decomplexify the rest of our lives in those times. So I advocate for playing in any style of game. The more complex you make it, the more like work it becomes. So you want to make it as intuitive as possible. That's fundamentally the reason why Nikos RPG is my choice for roleplay games. But we'll get back into that at a later time, not necessarily in this video. But we also need to redirect, and that is to consider what brings us joy about the activities that we are currently involved with to make sure that we are getting the best benefit out of it. I know that my dad used to just love college football. That was his sport. He watched college football, college basketball, and didn't care about anything about any of the pro sports at all. And for him, the joy was watching the teams and considering which teams were going to give which players and what the actual plays were. He loved teams that really switched it up and tried different things. He he had his favorites. Obviously, college people who follow college sports tend to have those schools that they hold in higher regard than the others. But especially like in the college March Madness and all of that. And I know that this pro sports also do the same thing, but he never advocated for the pro sports like he did for the college sports. But he wasn't doing it to prove anything. He wasn't doing it because he needed to win. He wasn't doing it so that he would benefit from it. And I think that's really, when it comes down to it, what we have to do is, when we consider this concept of advocating for recess, advocating for breaks in the day life of human beings, and put us back in the mode of being creative. I've talked about this for a long time, and I coined a phrase a long time ago, but I haven't really talked about it recently, and that is the idea that we are moving radically into a leisure economy. And the recent activities within like the concept of quiet quitting, and people who we used to call it ROAD, retired on active duty, when I was in the military. The idea that you were already putting the skids onto your actual work ethic because you were preparing to be in a leisure lifestyle. But I think that our culture is getting to the point where we need to be able to make that adjustment more effectively into this leisure economy, which means consider what it's going to take to operate at a lower revenue stream, or conversely find alternate revenue streams to make our lives more effective with a lower revenue stream. And I know I'm perhaps shouting into the wind here, but we need to decomplexify. We need to disconnect from the challenging, extremely onerous processes and find things that are more suitable and more enjoyable, because we have arguably a longer lifespan and less of a work burden in the near future. The advent of robotics and AI is radically going to change the work environment, and our culture is going to have to find ways to adapt. And one of the ways is to find those things that you enjoy doing, you love doing, that are enjoyable to you. I've talked before about ikigai, and we'll talk about that in another video here in a few sessions. But the idea of figuring out what they used to call the work-life balance, I think should be a work-play balance, because life is tough enough as it is. So we should find ways to take from our challenging life joy in these small parcels, and therefore increase our overall joy burden out of the challenges that we have. All right. So, here are my parting shots. I'm going to talk about an alternative concept, and that is to try to rediscover wonder in your life. Now, I know that there are those of you who scan over your videos and have long since walked past this one because of its longer form. But the idea here is that we need to find ways to find wonder. And one of the ways, of course, is by flipping through videos and choosing the ones that seem intriguing because they give us a chance. But make sure you include in that finding ones that will instill the idea of discovering wonder. There are things that people do that mystify and amaze me, and I love to take moments. And the other day I was in the process of doing something else, but I heard some music playing that got me thinking about some old songs, and so I went back to see whether I could find the old lyric sheets to some of the songs that we used to sing when I was a kid. And it's amazing how many of them have become labors of love for people, and this is true of art, this is true of hiking, people go and visit places that are amazing to me, and be able to travel along with them is really kind of cool. And so there's a reason to utilize the formats of entertainment that we have, but also try to do this rediscovering of wonder with each other, playing with other folk, because the way other people think becomes evident when you play a variety of games with them, whether they be role-playing games or card games or miniatures games. The way individuals think will change the way they play, and that gives you a new sense of wonder about what might you be capable of. And so the other element of rediscovering wonder is to think about what it is you could do within the framework of your life. And one of the biggest benefits of role-playing games is you're able to expand the possibilities beyond your day-to-day and consider, at least for a time, what you might do if you had a different occupation, a different locale, a different climate, and whether it be a survival game where you're trying not to get eliminated by the very processes of play, or if it's a Byzantine political game where you have to consider what you might be able to convince somebody of. These are all ways of reinvigorating the childlike nature that we have within us to be wondering and investigating and curious. And that curiosity will expand over time as you exercise those imagination muscles, if you will. Alrighty, I want to thank you for being here. We are at the end of this episode, and we will be continuing videos of this nature going forward. If you've got anything you'd like to talk about or would like me to discuss, I'd be glad to take it up, whether it be Q&A about role-play games and the history thereof, or mechanics on how to make your game more amazing. We are here Monday through Thursday, 10 a.m. and 11 p.m. Pacific time. And we are also here Friday mornings at 10 a.m. And we also are going to be endeavoring to start one of our game sessions as a live stream in the near future. Not sure which one yet. We're going to experiment around and figure out which one's best. But I want to thank you for being here, and hope to see you in the next episode. I'm Jonathan Alvin, and appreciate you being here at Nikos RPG.